One word, that is all it took. Standing in front of cameras at the NATO summit in Ankara, the prime minister who built his entire political career on the promise of standing up to Donald Trump looked at reporters and used the one word his supporters never expected to hear from his mouth. Won. Mark Carney said Donald Trump won, and he was not finished. In the same appearance, he said he supports the American strikes on Iran. 2 concessions, 1 press conference, from the man Canadians elected specifically because he promised never to bend. Why did Carney say Trump won? Here's the answer before we go any deeper. Carney was talking about NATO defense spending, and he stated plainly that Trump has succeeded in pushing Canada and European allies to spend more on their own defense, arguing that NATO members increasingly recognize the security threats they face. That is not a slip of the tongue. That is not a quote taken out of context by a hostile outlet. That is Canada's own national broadcaster reporting Canada's own Prime Minister crediting Donald Trump with a win on camera at an international summit. To understand why this single word is reverberating the way it is, you need to remember exactly who Mark Carney is supposed to be. This is the man who became prime minister on a promise summed up in 2 words, elbows up, a hockey phrase meaning defend yourself, never back down. Canadians handed him power in the middle of a trade war precisely because he positioned himself as the leader who would never give Trump an inch, never flatter him, never validate him. His entire mandate, the reason he sits in the office at all, was built on confrontation. And now, at a NATO summit with the whole alliance watching, he handed Trump exactly the kind of public validation his own political brand was constructed to withhold. So let's examine this confession the way it deserves to be examined 3 times over. First, what he actually said and the facts underneath it. Second, why he said it, because there is a strategy here whether you like it or not. And third, what it costs him, because words like this always have a price. First, the substance, because here is the uncomfortable part for anyone who wants to dismiss this as empty flattery. On the narrow question of NATO defense spending, Carney's statement is simply verifiably true. At last year's NATO summit, Trump extracted commitments from alliance members to move towards spending 5% of their annual economic output on defense over the coming decade, a target that would have been considered politically impossible in most member states just a few years earlier. And the alliance has largely moved to comply. This year's summit in Ankara was not about setting the target. It was about Trump personally showing up to enforce it, with his own ambassador to NATO telling reporters the president fully expects all allies to step up immediately and get on the path to 5% with urgency. Canada's own behavior proves the point more than any speech could. Canada has pledged to reach major new defense spending milestones by 2029, has moved forward on an enormous new submarine fleet with a preferred European bidder just named, and has hit NATO spending benchmarks it spent decades missing under previous governments. None of that happened in a vacuum. It happened under sustained, public, often insulting pressure from an American president who repeatedly threatened to reconsider America's commitment to defending allies who did not pay what he considered their fair share. Carney saying Trump won on this specific point is not weakness, it is arithmetic. The spending is happening, the pressure caused it, and pretending otherwise would require denying numbers his own government publishes. And here's the detail that makes the whole scene even stranger. The context most coverage of Carney's comments has skipped entirely. Trump spent that exact same summit attacking NATO, not praising it. He lashed out at the alliance on camera, saying openly that he was not happy with NATO, and separately blasted alliance members for rejecting his continued efforts to claim Greenland. So picture the actual scene in Ankara. An American president publicly berating the alliance, feuding over Greenland, threatening reviews of American troop deployments in Europe. And into that hostile atmosphere walks the Canadian Prime Minister, the one leader with arguably the longest list of grievances against this president. And he chooses that exact moment to hand Trump a compliment. When everyone else at the summit was absorbing attacks, Carney was volunteering praise. That contrast is what makes this moment genuinely remarkable rather than routine diplomatic politeness. And then came the second concession, the one that received less attention but may matter more. In the same appearance, Carney said he supports the American strikes on Iran. Think about the timing of that statement. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran has been collapsing. New American strikes have been launched. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth right now, and European allies have been agonizing over how closely to align themselves with Washington's approach. Into that moment steps the Prime Minister of Canada, the same leader frozen out of American trade talks, publicly backing the American military campaign without hedging. 2 concessions, 1 press conference. That is not an accident, and that brings us to the second examination, why he said it. Here is the strategic reading, and it deserves to be taken seriously before anyone writes this off as surrender. Carney is separating the battlefield. On trade, where Canada's interests are directly under attack, he concedes nothing, matches tariffs, builds pipelines pointing away from America, and lets his ministers throw pointed jabs about which country is a stable and reliable partner. But on security, where Canada's interests and America's interests genuinely overlap, he hands Trump full credit, loudly and publicly. This is a leader deliberately showing Washington that his resistance is not personal, not ideological, not reflexive. It is transactional, issue by issue. Fight me on trade, and I will fight back. Work with me on defense, and I will say so in front of every camera at the summit. There is a name for this in negotiation theory. And Carney, a man who ran 2 central banks through 2 separate global crises, knows it well. It is called costly signaling. Praise from an adversary is worth more than praise from a friend, precisely because everyone knows how much it costs the adversary to give it. When Carney says Trump won, the statement carries weight in Washington specifically because everyone in Washington knows Carney's voters hate hearing it. He is spending real domestic political capital to buy something, and the only question worth asking is what he is trying to buy. The most obvious answer sits in the one place Canada is still locked out: the trade table. As we covered across this series, Mexico is negotiating with Washington while Canada waits outside a closed door, explicitly punished for having retaliated against American tariffs when almost no other country dared. Every previous Canadian attempt to change that dynamic through argument, through formal submissions, through legal reasoning, has failed to move Washington at all. So watch what Carney is doing instead. He is not arguing anymore. He is demonstrating publicly at the highest possible profile that cooperation with him produces exactly what Trump wants most: public credit, public wins, public validation on the world stage. It is an audition, performed in front of the one audience member who decides whether Canada gets back in the room. And notice that the defense file is the one arena where Carney can make this play without giving up anything he was not already giving. The submarine fleet was already moving forward with the preferred European bidder just named, and the chief executive of that shipbuilder declaring the real work begins now. The spending increases were already legislated, already budgeted, already headed toward those 2029 milestones, regardless of what anyone said at any summit. In other words, Carney handed Trump credit for outcomes that were already locked in. spending words that cost him domestic capital but zero actual policy concessions. That is what makes this move so characteristically Carney. The compliment was real, the political risk was real, but the material giveaway was precisely nothing. He paid in currency Trump values most, public validation, without transferring a single additional dollar, contract, or policy beyond what was already committed. And there is a second, colder possibility that has to be said out loud. Maybe Carney has simply concluded that the confrontation strategy failed. 18 months of elbows up produced a frozen trade relationship, a punished economy, a bridge deal where Canada surrendered half the profits on infrastructure it fully paid for, and a stack of tariffs still sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and energy. If defiance was supposed to produce results, the results have not arrived. A central banker reads a losing trade faster than a politician does, and central bankers do not hold losing positions out of pride. This may be the sound of a position being quietly unwound. Now, the third examination, what this costs him, because the price is real and it is already being collected. Inside Canada, the reaction writes itself. Opposition voices have spent months accusing Carney of talking tough while delivering nothing, of elbows up rhetoric that was, in their words, just for show. A prime minister who won office promising confrontation and now publicly credits Trump with victories hands his critics their closing argument for free. Every conservative attack ad for the next election effectively wrote itself in that single press conference. He said Trump won. No context survives contact with a 30-second commercial. And the deeper domestic problem is not the opposition, it is his own base. The Canadians who lined up behind Carney did not do so because they wanted a skilled technocrat managing a difficult relationship. Many of them wanted a champion, someone who would voice their genuine fury at a neighbor who slapped tariffs on their jobs and mused openly about annexing their country as a 51st state. For those voters, hearing their champion say the word "won" about the man who caused all of it does not read as strategy. It reads as betrayal, and betrayal is the one emotion in politics that never fully heals. Remember what this specific audience has lived through to understand why the word lands so hard at home. This is a country whose neighbor has spent a year and a half openly musing about annexing it as a 51st state. A country that watched its fully financed bridge get held hostage until it surrendered half the profits. A country explicitly named by Washington's own trade chief alongside China as one of only 2 nations on Earth that dared to retaliate. Canadian national identity has genuinely reorganized itself around this confrontation in a way not seen in generations, with boycotts of American products, canceled vacations south of the border, and a surge of flag-waving patriotism that political scientists have compared to wartime cohesion. Into that emotional landscape, the leader of that movement just said the other side won. Even if he only meant one narrow file, defense spending, the word does not stay in its lane. Words like that never do. There is also an international price that fewer people are discussing. Every other middle power leader watching that press conference just received a data point. Carney himself stood at Davos months ago and argued that middle powers must not compete for the favor of hegemons, that they must stand together and hold their ground. Now, the author of that doctrine is publicly crediting the hegemon with victory and endorsing his military campaign. Allies who took Carney's Davos speech seriously, who began coordinating their own positions around the idea of collective resistance to American pressure, are entitled to wonder whether the doctrine was ever real or whether it was always a bargaining posture waiting for the right price. So which is it? Genius or capitulation? Here is the honest answer, and it is the same answer that is run underneath this entire series. It is both, and which one it turns out to be depends entirely on what Washington does next. If Canada gets its seat at the trade table in the coming weeks, if the frozen talks thaw, if the next round of tariff decisions quietly spares Canadian industries, then this press conference will be remembered as the moment a master negotiator paid a small domestic price for a large international win. But if Washington pockets the concessions and gives nothing back, if Canada stays locked out while Mexico signs its deal, then Carney will have handed Trump two propaganda victories for free, weakened his own domestic standing, and undermined the middle power coalition he spent a year building, all in exchange for nothing at all. That is the gamble, and it is genuinely enormous. Because here is the thing about costly signals. They only work on counterparts who honor them. The entire strategy depends on Trump treating Carney's concession as an opening bid in a negotiation rather than as evidence that pressure works and more pressure will produce more concessions. And if there is one consistent lesson across every single episode of this series, from the bridge to the boycott to the frozen trade talks, it is that this White House treats concessions as proof of leverage, not as invitations to reciprocate. Let's walk through the three scenarios because this one genuinely could break any direction. Scenario 1, the thaw. Within weeks, Washington announces the opening of formal bilateral trade discussions with Canada, framed around shared security cooperation and the new spirit demonstrated at the summit. Carney's gamble pays off spectacularly. The domestic grumbling fades the moment tariff relief arrives, and this press conference gets rewritten by history as the pivot point where Canada played its hand perfectly. Scenario 2. The pocket. Washington accepts the praise, amplifies the clips of Carney saying Trump won across every friendly outlet, and changes absolutely nothing about the trade freeze. Canada remains outside the room, now with less leverage than before, because the world has watched its prime minister blink first. This is the scenario Carney's critics are already predicting, and the historical pattern of this administration makes it impossible to dismiss. Scenario 3. The collapse at home. The concessions produce nothing abroad while igniting a genuine revolt domestically. Carney's polling, built almost entirely on his image as the man who stands up to Trump, begins to crack. The conservative opposition, which has struggled to land a glove on him while the country rallied around the flag, suddenly finds its opening. And the irony becomes complete. Donald Trump ends the career of the second consecutive Canadian Prime Minister, this time not by attacking him, but simply by accepting his praise. Here is my honest read. Carney did not misspeak, and he did not surrender. This was a calculated payment made by a man who calculates everything toward a specific goal, reopening the trade relationship that every other approach failed to unlock. But I think he has underpriced the risk on the other side of the trade. This administration has shown over and over in this exact relationship that it reads accommodation as weakness and responds to weakness with escalation. The bridge deal proved it. The Mexico contrast proved it. The tariff stack proved it. Carney is betting that security cooperation operates by different rules than trade. He had better be right, because he just spent political capital he cannot easily replace, and the man he handed it to has never once in this entire saga given change back. And there is already early evidence the two-track pattern is real, because look at how Carney handled the bridge deal in the days after the summit. Rather than disputing Trump's claim of a much better deal on the Gordie Howe crossing, the story we broke down in our last episode, Carney has been actively downplaying the entire toll dispute, declining to contest Trump's victory framing, letting the American president keep his win uncontested. A leader in full confrontation mode would have corrected the record loudly, pointing out that Canada paid every dollar of that bridge. A leader running the strategy we just described does exactly what Carney is doing, absorbing the framing, staying quiet, and keeping his eyes on the only prize that matters, the reopening of trade talks. The bridge silence and the summit praise are not two separate stories. They are the same strategy, observed twice in 1 week. Watch two things in the coming weeks. Watch whether any movement appears on Canada trade talks, because that is the return Carney is waiting on, and its arrival or absence will tell you which scenario we are living in. And watch Carney's language at his next domestic press conference, because if the elbows up rhetoric suddenly returns for home audiences while the summit warmth continues abroad, you will know the two-track strategy is deliberate, and you will know exactly how he intends to survive the contradiction. Tell me in the comments below, did Carney just make the smartest move of this entire trade war, or did the man elected to never bend just bend for nothing? Genius or capitulation? I want to know where you land. And if you want to see what Washington does with the concession it was just handed, make sure you are subscribed, because the answer to that question decides everything that comes next in this story.